time is source material panel. We've got three fantastic speakers. Firstly, it's going to be Robbie Hand. Robbie is a PhD student here at Roehampton in the English department, and you're working on the Before Shakespeare project. That's going to be followed by Ella Wilkins, our lovely lecturer. And Ella is a PhD student at the University of Birmingham Shakespeare Institute. And then we'll have Robin Craig, who works at Shakespeare's Globe and is about to start a PhD here at Roehampton in the English and theatre departments. Great, so I think we'll just begin and then we'll have Q&A afterwards.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this paper came out of my experience working at the Globe in the education department last year, though I should stress that it's not, I don't speak with any authority from the Globe on any of these matters. Okay, so in April 2016, Emma Rice's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream opened at Shakespeare's Globe. The fourth time a full-scale in-house production of the play had been staged there, with tours and visiting productions raising that total to 9 in the space of about 15 years. Particular attention was paid to this one, however, as it marked, of course, the beginning of Emma Rice's tenure as artistic director. The elaborate set design, very much in keeping with Rice's work for her company Knee-High, included a large neon sign reading "Rock the Ground," Oberon's line from Act 4. And this production made it very clear that things were going to be done differently now. Audiences, new and returning, were by and large ecstatic, and the reviews were very positive. Susanna Clapp of The Observer was not unusual in declaring that Rice had, quotes, thrown down a glittering gauntlet with her Globe debut, and the entire run sold out. Now, fast forward exactly 6 months, and the announcement of Rice's second summer season was rather overshadowed by the accompanying revelation that it would be her last. And this was announced, by the way, on the 25th of October, or St Crispin's Day, so never let it be said that HR departments don't have a sense of humour. The Globe CEO, Neil Constable, said in a press release that Rice's season had generated productive debate concerning the purpose and theatrical practice of the Globe in relation to the use of sound and lighting technology within our theatre spaces. Following much deliberation and discussion, the Globe Board has concluded that from April 2018, the theatre programming should be structured around shared light productions without design sound and light rigging, which characterised a large body of the Globe's work prior to Emma's appointment. Now, indeed, prior to the start of the season, Rice's team had installed a full-scale lighting rig and sound system. Now, this involved serious structural alterations to the space, as you can see, which, regardless of what you think of their historical accuracy, had had much care and craft put into them. Now, the new technology was put to full use in Midsummer, with some dazzling lighting effects, striking sound design, and much more. And Rice made it clear that subsequent directors would be free to use the technology as and if they so wished. So with that in mind, this is an issue that for many theatregoers seemed almost impossibly trivial, and the board, citing it as the reason for Rice's departure, was met largely with incredulity. There was belief in some quarters that it was simply a front disguising a different reason for her departure, misogyny perhaps, and there was plenty of that, unfortunately, from certain commentators, though not, I must stress, from the Globe or its board, or simply a resistance to change, to innovation, or to anything too radical. So, on last St Crispin's Day, what had previously appeared to be just a fraught relationship between the different factions of the Globe community turned into an all-out war. Rice may have stood down, but it became clear that the battle to establish a narrative of what happened and why was only beginning. Matthew Dunster, who's then and now Rice's associate and a director who interestingly had worked at the Globe under the previous regime, sided vociferously with Rice. Dunster publicly defended his boss, sending out a string of tweets throughout the day. He said he was heartbroken by the decision. He reassured audiences that her second and now final season would be no less radical and exciting, and then concluded with "fuck off," seemingly directed at no one in particular. A few months later, he posted another rather surprising message, retweeting a story about the Anglican Church's ongoing dispute over LGBT issues. In this case, whether or not church schools should continue to teach the, quote, traditional interpretation of marriage. Now, Dunster posted this, adding, "Why did this make me think of the board of the Globe?" Seemingly comparing the Globe's board of directors, which includes Laurie Maguire and Zoe Wanamaker, among others, to religious conservatives taking a stand against an inclusive, modernising influence. This continued the theme of treating opposition to Rice's work as fundamentally backwards-looking, that is to say, motivated by a desire to keep things as they are, and an opposition in principle to change. As Rice herself put it on the day her resignation was announced, how can a 20-year-old building have become so fossilised? Now, in this comment, Rice hits, I think inadvertently, on a very important point, because there are two theatre histories at work here. Early modern theatre history, that is, an attempt to learn about the original theatre practice of Shakespeare's time, and the Globe's own theatre history, 20 years as a functioning modern theatre, and 33 since the organisation was established on Bankside and its first employee was hired, who's still there. It's this important and often misunderstood 20th and 21st century theatre history that the Globe Board, and indeed many of us who've worked there, are keen to respect and understand. Now, that respect need not stand in the way of exciting and, yes, radical work. I mentioned earlier that there was a sense among some commentators that the real reason for the board's decision was a resistance to anything too radical, and indeed radicalism, both the idea and definition of it, is at the heart of the Emma Rice debate. Both sides claimed it, and both disputed the other's claim. It's a somewhat nebulous term, of course, but on some level obviously refers to pulling roots out, challenging what we think of as being the base, immovable point of something. I should say at this point that I think Rice made many valuable and indeed radical contributions to the Globe as an organisation that were evident from this first production of Midsummer. Her refreshingly diverse casting was a much-needed change from the previous regime, and her willingness to play fast and loose with the text was also welcome, though not, crucially, remotely unusual for a modern production of Shakespeare, whether at the Globe or anywhere else. We may have an image of a kind of stuffy, text-obsessed mode of Shakespearean performance from some unspecified point in the past, but the fact is that theatre practitioners have for a long time been very willing to chop, change, and even rewrite Shakespeare. In some cases, this involves subtle cuts and tweaks to suit contemporary tastes and understandings, but also more substantial revisions, such as John Barton's additions to the Henry VI plays for his and Peter Hall's Wars of the Roses trilogy. And there are, of course, the ad-libbing comedic performers who've been getting on Hamlet's nerves for over 400 years now. At one point in Rice's Midsummer, one of the mechanicals shouted in exasperation, "Why is everybody so obsessed with text?" This line became something of a lightning rod for the controversies surrounding Rice's regime. And both times I saw the play, it drew a mixture of cheers and good-humoured derision from different parts of the audience. The answer to the mechanical's question, however, why is everybody so obsessed with text, is that by and large they're not. The line was clearly a joke, but it was a telling moment in a production that was largely unfamiliar with theatre history. And again, I don't mean early modern theatre history, I'm talking about the history of 20th and 21st century Shakespearean performance, not least the relatively short history of the modern Globe. Rice's radicalism was, and is, paradoxically, one that demonstrates remarkably little sense of time or context. At best, it's ill-informed, at worst, simply a kind of straw man situation. And the Globe project is, in its own way, a radical one, and not necessarily in the way that its founders anticipated. Although it was not the first reconstruction of Elizabethan playhouse, it can, I think, lay some claim to being the first to succeed in its own right as a modern theatre, the first to bridge that gap, if you like. And writing in 1997, J.R. Mulrine and Margaret Shuring worried about several aspects of the appeal of such of a space such as the Globe in the 20th century. One of these worries was the sheer size of the place, its assumed lack of intimacy. Comparing it to the Royal Shakespeare's Swan Auditorium, built in the 80s, and which is also a thrust stage with the audience on three sides, but much, much smaller, they praised the Swan's intimacy, but regretted that while something of the same sort might be said about the Globe, the terms need modification to allow for the anti-illusionistic effect of the Daylight Auditorium. This, to clarify, was before the theatre had opened. Where the Swan uses the full range of modern stage lighting, on the Globe stage the actor is exposed as a result of sharing the same visual space with the audience, unmodified by the conditioning effects of illusionistic stage lighting. The potential for intimacy is qualified at the rebuilt Globe by the epic scale of the plays and the presence, ideally, of a full house of spectators. And one thing that Globe actors and audiences alike have almost always said, however, is that this expectation is quickly proven false. Farrah Karen Cooper has discussed this in her recent book on stage gesture, quoting MC Bradbrook's assumption that, quote, conventional movement and heightened delivery would be necessary in the space. Karen Cooper notes that the actors in the reconstructed Globe, in fact, deploy a complex range of gestural arts, stillness being as effective there as immoderate movement. She uses the example of Roger Allen as Falstaff, who might just about be able to see there, whose performance in certain key scenes was characterised by stillness, which was emotionally riveting and widely visible in the amphitheatre. Allen admitted that he'd been sceptical about the Globe when it opened, but later won over when he actually got around to visiting it, a sentiment that was echoed by many of the actors that I interviewed myself while I was working there. Brendan O'Hay, for instance, admitted that he had never seen a play at the Globe before auditioning there in 2012. I was trying to make a point about subtlety, but there are no subtle pictures of this man, so I had very strong opinions, he said. It's a place just for tourists, and the work's too generalised. As soon as you get in there, you realise how small you can take it. It's nothing to do with volume. It's the clarity of intention that carries. He also discussed the visibility of the audience in the shared light, and the effect this has both on actors and other audience members. For a big speech, he says, you might have a lovely long journey around one of the pillars, and you include that side of the house, then throw it up to the opposite side, upstage right, way up, because the problem is, if you don't keep them interested, the people in the side seats, that is, then they start to get very restless, and the major body of the audience, the groundlings and the people in the smart seats in the middle, his words, will be distracted by them. So those people in the sides have to be entertained as well. So while the Globe poses challenges to an actor, they're challenges to which the actors tend to rise and which, in their view, improve their abilities as performers. While some scholars have continued to dismiss the Globe project because of its obvious inability to provide evidence of early modern performance practice, I think it deserves more credit for the way it has, beyond anyone's expectations, influenced modern Shakespearean theatre practice, nowhere more so than the Globe's great rival, the Royal Shakespeare Company. During the time that the Globe was being built in the 90s, the RSC was going through rather troubled times. Its main Stratford house, the old Royal Shakespeare Theatre, was full of the latest technological bells and whistles, which they seemed to deploy insistently no matter what the production. But it was becoming rather dated as a performance space, cavernous and with extremely poor acoustics. This really was a space that was unsuited to modern performance styles. So when it was renovated, or rather completely rebuilt, in the mid to late 2000s, the new design attempted to capitalise on the success and surprising intimacy of the Globe, essentially becoming a larger version of the next-door Swan space I mentioned earlier. It's certainly an improvement, but the lighting is an issue on which several RSC actors have commented. The space encourages interaction with the spectators, but the dimming of the house lights and the glaring spotlights on the actors make this very difficult for all but the nearest few rows. In a recent Q&A, the actors in the current RSC production of Julius Caesar, several of whom had performed at the Globe, and I imagine almost all of whom had seen the play there, commented that the nature of the space left them longing for the more personal intimacy of the Bankside venue. So while the Globe's critics have considered it a futile attempt to recreate an unobtainable past, the Globe has emerged as a space to which actors adapt with ease and enthusiasm, and in this context it's the RSC theatre that feels like the halfway house imitation. So, back to Midsummer. An argument on which I heard several variations from Rice's sceptics and critics during the run was that it was a great production but unsuited to the Globe. I'd have enjoyed it somewhere else, or words to that effect. While I understand the reasoning behind this idea, I would suggest that almost the opposite is true. It was a good production on its own terms, to be sure, but it was elevated by the very fact that it clashed so conspicuously with the Globe as a space, and from what we've come to expect from it. This point, curiously enough, was touched on by none other than our friend Matthew Dunster, who, in a less combative mood, said of his own production of Imogen, "Nothing that is tried by artists is irreversible. Imogen tests the technology at its most extreme, that's conscious. It's a way of testing what this kind of adaptation would do for and to the audience, and it's found its own audience, young people who have had their socks blown off by the production because it's at the Globe." Now, given that Midsummer was Rice's opening production, I assumed, perhaps naively, that this was a sort of statement production, an announcement that there was a new team in town. As the season continued, however, it became more apparent that this was not an artistic policy that was playing around with convention, but rather one that was simply unaware of it, and unattuned to the strengths of the Globe as a playing space. Dimming the lights at the start of the show and plunging the audience into darkness to mark the end of an act, as almost every production did, was not done to shock. It was done because that's what the directors had done everywhere else they'd worked. We have then something of a clash between how actors and directors feel about the space. I think this was particularly evident in the open letter recently published recently by Rice to the as yet unannounced new artistic director. Now, the Globe as an organisation is structured unusually for a theatre in that the artistic director is not the most senior position. They're the head of the theatre department, which is a role on the same hierarchical level as the head of education, visitor experience, and so forth. And it's this collaborative nature, the requirement for the artistic policy to cohere with the work of the other departments rather than lead and dictate it, that seems to have caused the problems for Rice's much more conventional director-led approach. As Rice said, I chose to leave because, as important and beloved as the Globe is to me, the board did not love and respect me back. I did not understand what I saw, what I felt, and what I created with my actors, creative teams, and the audience. Nothing is worth giving away my artistic freedom for. It has been too hard fought for. Now, I'm not here to criticise Rice's principles, and I won't, but the question for another paper, I'm afraid, is the extent to which the Globe can ever really be a director's theatre. What the Globe is not and never has been as a shrine, it's not about authenticity or recreating history or providing a window to the past. But theatre history has always informed the Globe project, an interest in and yes, respect for our theatrical past, and a desire to learn as much as we can about it. To argue that the Globe thrives when staging productions in, as the press release said, shared light, and with minimal or if any amplification, suggests this is not a reactionary position motivated by a fear of change. It is, in our current theatrical culture, perhaps even a radical one, informed by a desire to capitalise on what makes the Globe today such a valuable and unusual performance space. A desire to make use of its USP, if you like, the thing that has the directors of other theatre companies saying, get me one of those. By the same token, there is, of course, something radical about challenging what we think of as being the Globe's house style. And I think Rice does have a claim to radicalism. I'm just not sure that, for want of a better term, she's uprooting the radish that she thinks she is. To say that the artistic director of the Globe should familiarise themselves with theatre history is not to suggest that there are any rules at all about what they then do with that knowledge, but, as any radical knows, you have to understand the rules in order to know best how to break them. Thank you.